Every dollar of tariff cost ended up on the receipt, not half, not 70%. The full amount. On April 8, 2026, the Federal Reserve published results from a year-long study tracking how tariffs moved from the border to the checkout line. For every dollar tariffs added to the cost of importing a product, retailers charged consumers $1 more. The study's authors stated it directly. If a retailer's acquisition cost for a good rises $1 because of tariffs, they charge $1 more 7 months later. That is near 100% pass-through, and it explains why core goods, physical products like appliances, clothing, and furniture, are now 3.1% more expensive than they would have been without these tariffs. Between 2015 and 2019, core goods prices were falling at roughly 0.7% a year. That downward trend has reversed. The entire gap between current prices and the pre-pandemic trajectory is accounted for by tariffs alone. The researchers had flagged this trajectory early: Robert Minton, Madeleine Ray, and Mariano Somale. The study's authors at the Federal Reserve Board published a first installment in May of 2025, just 3 months into the tariff rollout. Even with limited data, they found evidence that China tariffs from February and March were already reaching consumer prices, measuring a 0.3% increase in core goods at that stage. 11 months later, the effect had grown tenfold. Separately, in February 2026, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York published its own analysis of who was absorbing the cost. From January through August 2025, approximately 94% of the tariff burden fell on American firms and consumers. By November, after several trade deals shifted the balance slightly, it was still 86%. The costs accumulated through 26 separate tariff actions spread across 9 months. On February 4, 2025, the first China fentanyl tariff added 10 percentage points. 1 month later, a second round added 10 more on China, alongside a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican non-USMCA goods. 8 days after that, 25% tariffs hit all steel and aluminum imports globally. Imported cars followed on April 3rd at 25%. Then on April 9th, widely referred to as Liberation Day, the broadest action landed: 125 additional percentage points on most Chinese goods and a baseline 10% on imports from nearly every other country. The pace continued through the rest of the year. Auto parts were tariffed in May. Steel and aluminum doubled to 50% in June. Modified reciprocal tariffs covering more than 60 countries took effect in August. Deals with the EU and Japan came in September. Timber, lumber, and furniture tariffs arrived in October. By November, a partial China tariff reduction and additional trade agreements closed out the calendar. The Fed study tracked all 26 events and measured how long each took to reach consumer prices. About half the price increase from a given tariff appeared within 3 months. Full dollar-for-dollar transfer stabilized at roughly 7 months, within a range of 5 to 9. Tariffs enacted in February 2025 were fully reflected in prices by approximately September. The April tariffs reached full effect around November. Later rounds were still working through the system when the data was collected in February 2026. The specific measure the study used is Core Goods PCE, the Fed's preferred inflation gauge for physical products, excluding food and energy. That index rose 2.3% year-over-year in February 2026. On its own, that figure may appear modest, but measured against the pre-pandemic trend of negative 0.7% a year, the swing is a full 3 percentage points, and the study attributes all of it to tariff pass-through. Since core goods represent about a quarter of overall core PCE, the tariff contribution to economy-wide core inflation was 0.8 percentage points. Multiple institutions have translated that figure into household costs. The Yale Budget Lab calculated annual costs between $570 and $1,338 per household. The Tax Foundation estimated roughly $1,500. J.P. Morgan placed it between 1,050 and 1,300. These are not forecasts. They reflect costs already absorbed. The Yale Budget Lab also noted the burden is regressive. For the lowest income households, tariff costs represent about 2.7% of earnings, compared to 0.8% for the highest earners. Food prices tell a parallel story. The USDA's food price outlook for 2026, updated in late March, projected grocery prices rising 3.1% for the year. Specific categories were hit harder: beef and veal up 10.1%, sugar and sweets up 6.7%, non-alcoholic beverages up 6.5%, the last driven largely by global coffee prices. These increases reflect both tariff effects and other supply conditions, but they compound the same pressure on household budgets. The administration disputed the connection between tariffs and consumer costs. NEC Director Kevin Hassett called the earlier New York Fed study, in his words, the worst paper he had ever seen in the history of the Federal Reserve System. He argued that real wages rose $1,400 in 2025, making consumers better off despite tariff costs, and contended that these studies ignore wage and income effects. U.S. Trade Representative Jamison Greer argued that tariffs are not regressive. Some independent estimates also arrived at lower pass-through figures. Goldman Sachs placed the consumer share at 55% as of early 2026, potentially climbing to 70% as inventories depleted and contracts were renegotiated. Harvard researcher Alberto Cavallo, using online retail price data from major retailers, measured pass-through at 24%. The Fed study's authors addressed this discrepancy directly, explaining that it is largely definitional. Cavallo's figure is expressed as a share of the border price, the Fed's is dollar for dollar at the consumer level, because goods sell for roughly 2.7 times their border price on average after wholesale and retail markups. The two measures are, in the study's language, consistent. An alternative version of the Fed's own model produced a lower estimate. With certain statistical controls removed, the tariff boost to core PCE dropped from 0.8% to 0.4%. The authors acknowledged they could not determine definitively which specification was correct. The lower figure implies that tariffs may be creating downward pressure on overall demand through reduced spending, wealth effects, or economic uncertainty, partially offsetting the relative price increases on tariffed goods. Both effects reduce household purchasing power through different channels. One historical comparison is worth noting. When similar tariffs were imposed on China in 2018 and 2019, the same research team found pass-through occurred within 2 months rather than 5 to 9. The pass-through coefficient was also higher, between 1.75 and 2.12, meaning firms raised prices beyond the tariff cost itself. The researchers suggested tariffs functioned as a coordination device, giving firms a signal to raise prices more broadly. In 2025, the coefficient settled closer to 1.0. Firms passed through exactly the tariff cost, but no more. One explanation is that post-pandemic inflation had already increased the frequency of price changes, reducing the coordinating effect. As of April 2026, the legal and policy landscape has shifted. The Supreme Court ruled on February 20th that the IEEPA authority underpinning many of these tariffs was unconstitutional. A temporary Section 122 tariff of 10% on all imports replaced them, but that authority expires July 24th, 2026. Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, autos, trucks, lumber, furniture, and semiconductors remain. New 100% tariffs on pharmaceuticals are scheduled for July 31st. 16 Section 301 investigations launched in March are widely interpreted as an effort to establish replacement tariff authority before the Section 122 window closes. The average effective tariff rate across all imports currently sits at roughly 10.3% compared to about 2.5% before these actions began. The Federal Reserve study concluded that pass-through from the 2025 tariff rounds is, in their words, effectively complete. The tariff structures that drove those increases largely remain in place. The prices they pushed up have not reversed, and the cumulative 3.1% increase in core goods prices is measured not in economic models, but at the register.